A new inspection report has raised concerns about the care and health care available in police custody suites. The Criminal Justice Inspection and the Regulation and Quality Improvement Authority have published a joint review following up previous work. It found that only one of the 6 strategic recommendations and none of the operational recommendations made 5 years ago had been fully implemented. And the CGI Chief Inspector Jacqui Durkin joins us now in studio. Good to see you. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris and Sarah.
You take a look at this report and it is very clear that you wanted things to change on previous occasions and that hasn't happened. Now, we talk about nurse-led healthcare provision. That's what you talk about in this report. What does that actually mean?
Well, what that actually means in this report is that there's a nurse presence, nurses on site in custody suites to provide very timely care and appropriate care to people who come into detention. And very often you'll find people who arrive in police custody, they can be under the influence of substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs. They can be in mental health crisis. They can have other physical health care needs, and they need prompt attention, and they're entitled to access to a medical assessment when they come into detention.
And why do you believe that things have not changed since you talked about this previously?
Well, we know from the work that the inspectors did in assessing the recommendations that some work had been done, and some 8 of the strategic and operational recommendations, there had been some partial implementation and progress, but there's more to be done, and particularly around the rollout of the nurse-led model across all the police custody suites. And there's other recommendations as well that we want to see some progress in, and that's around the governance of forensic medical officers and improvements to care planning. So there's more work to be done. Some has started, but there's no doubt that we couldn't satisfy ourselves that the recommendations had been appropriately implemented.
I suppose there might be people listening to this who will say that if this is something that needs to be changed and it's not being changed, is that criticism both of your organisation as well as the police? Because arguably you could make the argument that you have been in a position of saying this needs to happen and it's not been happening. Why hasn't this gone through? Why is the pressure not on?
So whenever recommendations are made and accepted, as all these recommendations were, it's for those organisations that have been inspected and accepted the recommendations to take them forward. We don't have the capacity to do follow-up reviews on every inspection report, but we certainly look at the risk base associated with follow-up reviews and channel what resources we have to looking at those. So the care of people in detention, as part of our role and RKIA's role as National Preventive Mechanism members, we are monitors of the standards of care and the safety of care for people who are held in detention, whether that's in a police custody cell, a court cell, or in Woodlands Juvenile Justice Centre or in a prison. So that's part of our inspection programme every year, is to look at places of detention. But the onus is on inspected organisations to work together with partners to take that work forward. And I think it's important to say that we welcome and can provide assurance where the work has been done and where improvements has been made. But it's clear here that while we welcome what has been done, there's more to be done to address those recommendations, and we expected more to be done in a 5-year period.
You talked about juvenile facilities, and I do want to talk about children and young people in just a second, because again, that is something that is contained in this report and concerns about that. But it's worth just sort of teasing out exactly what this means, this lack of nurse-led healthcare. Is this having an impact on some people who are brought in? Is it having an impact on some people who might be detained who are vulnerable?
Well, in areas where there isn't a nurse-led unit, so in those custody suites where they're relying on the services of a forensic medical officer to attend a custody suite and to examine someone or provide medication, or whether they need particular, if they have a minor injury that needs attention. So it means that where there's not a nurse-led unit, some of those people can end up going to A&E. So they're going to have to be transported, and they're going to had to be looked after while they're in A&E. And we all know that that isn't, if we can avoid people going to an accident emergency unit, that's what we want to do. So it's about the immediacy of the care and the appropriateness of the care. And we also know from speaking to the nurses who are working in those units, that the value of that care and the ability of detainees to be able to speak to someone who is focusing on their health care is invaluable, because they can make disclosures about maybe they've taken a substance or maybe they're having mental health issues, and their ability to speak to a nurse where they may not speak to a custody sergeant or police personnel or civilian personnel working in a custody suite. We know, and we've had very positive feedback about the experience of people who have had that nurse-led care.
You're suggesting now there's maybe a false economy in this, because the pressure then goes on to the health service and that then potentially causes problems. But you might hear from the police, and they have not said this, but there is no doubt a pressure on resources. Is the money available to make these changes one of the problems here? Because presumably it's quite expensive to have a nurse that is available at a police custody suite at all times.
Well, the police have been working in partnership with the Department of Health and with the Belfast Trust around these arrangements, and they've been discussing them for some time. So the arrangements about the value for money or the benefits of having these services in place, I mean, that argument has been discussed and agreed. And yes, of course, like everything in health and justice at the minute, resources have to be a consideration, but there also has to be the benefits and the value of having those services available and what they mean in the wider health service in particular, where people may need to be transported to hospital and kept there, and the advantage of them having access, as they should have, to a health assessment when they come into custody.
I mentioned children and young people. Again, in this report, you talk about that and a real concern about how they remand, how they bail, and how they provide custody arrangements for children and young people. What's the worry there?
Well, the real worry is, and we've known this for some time, is the access for children to bail and be able to get bail rather than being committed into the care of the Woodlands Juvenile Justice Centre. And that might be used, and is too frequently still used, as a place of safety. And what we see as well is that too many looked after children or care experienced children are making up part of that cohort. Almost 50% of children who do end up being detained in custody are care experienced children, and there has to be alternatives to custody for those children, whether that's an alternative children's home, or be able to get them bail accommodation or access to social care support that they need.
I know it's not quite within your remit to talk at length about this, but even that idea that these looked after children, which have caused you a lot of concern, but it's clear from this report that is the case. The fact that they are ending up in this kind of system as well, that the fact that they're ending up having to be dealt with in this kind of situation, does that indicate that there are issues potentially as well with how they're being looked after?
Well, I couldn't say that, but what I can say is that when they are coming into contact with the police, there should be the same presumption as there is for any other child, that bail they should only be committed to custody as a last resort. And I'm pleased that legislation is being progressed. It's taken a lot longer than it should have been, and reform to policing criminal evidence. So it's important that those reforms are taken forward, but it's also important that they are implemented and that alternative accommodation is available to children who may otherwise end up in detention and in custody.
Just finally, what's your message for the Chief Constable? Because, there clearly is, in very careful and very diplomatic language, as you would expect from a report like this, still a little bit of frustration by the fact that recommendations are not going into place. What would you say to the Chief Constable?
Well, I wouldn't say anything different than I would say to John Boucher's face when we do meet. There is the issue around, there's the resource issue, but there's also the issue of not doing something and the benefits of a nurse-led model and the improvements that have to be made regardless of the nurse-led care. There are other improvements and recommendations that don't have a pound sign attached to them necessarily, and that need to make sure that there's appropriate governance and oversight to make sure these recommendations are completely implemented.
Jacqui, really appreciate you coming in as always.
Thank you.
That's CGI Chief Inspector Jacqui Durkin.